This is part two of the guided reading for the short story Harrison Bergeron. If you have already started taking your notes for active reading, go ahead and take those out. It should be either a Google Doc or in a spiral notebook. To ease your process, go ahead and make a T chart. On the left hand side of the T, write details. On the right hand side, write explanation. I'll be reading through the text, asking you to pause at certain points to add to your notes, and then at the end, we'll finish by asking a question, and then in the explain portion, explaining the answer. I could think if it was just chimes, said George. Well, maybe make them real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good handicapper general. Good as anybody else, said George. Who knows better than I do what normal is, said Hazel. Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son who was now in jail, about Harrison. But a 21-year-old gun salute in his head stopped that. Boy, said Hazel, that was a doozy, wasn't it? It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood in the rims of his red eyes. Two of the eight ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor. They were holding their temples. Okay, at this point, the author is giving you many details. Go ahead and note the details about the sounds that each person heard, the sound that George heard, the sound the ballerinas heard, the specific detail about George's son, Harrison, where he is, and then the action or reaction of when George tries to think. Add those to your notes. I'll continue. All of a sudden, you look so tired, said Hazel. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so as you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, Honey Bunch? She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in a canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck. Go on and rest the bag for a little while, she said. I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while. George weighed the bag with his hands. I don't mind it, he said. I don't notice it anymore. It's just part of me. Okay, pause there. Notice how the author is giving you details. Note the detail of the weight of the bag. Note the detail of the comparison. Hazel has the same weight, so make note of that. Notice how it makes her and him equal. Make note of that. And then next, make note of George's reaction when she asks him to remove it. Let's continue. You've been so tired lately, kind of worn out, said Hazel. If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of the bag and just take out a few of them lead balls. Just a few. Huh. 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out, said George. I don't call that a bargain. Okay, at this point, stop, take notes. Notice how the author is giving you details about the weight, and then there's also an action and a consequence. So take note of what happens when somebody removes the weight from themselves. Let's continue. If you could just take a few out when you came home from work, said Hazel. I don't mean don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around. If I tried to get away with it, said George, then other people would get away with it. And it. And pretty soon we'd be right back to the dark ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? I'd hate it, said Hazel. There you are, said George. The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society? If Hazel hadn't come up with an answer to this question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head. Reckon it'd fall apart, said Hazel. What would, said George blankly. Society, and Hazel said uncertainly. Wasn't that what you just said? Hmm, who knows, said George. Okay, notice how take notes again. Details and explanation. Details are notice the noises that happen and notice when they happen to George. Notice the laws and answer these questions in the explain part of your T chart. How does this society feel about equality and competition? What happened to George when the siren went off in his head? Be sure you're taking notes. If you have any details that you've not explained fully yet, go ahead and go back to those notes at this time and explain each one fully. You may use phrases like, this reminds me of, or I didn't know this, or I'm curious about, or I'm curious why.